Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Rachel Massey, and I'm the Senior Science and Policy Advisor with CHE, the Collaborative for Health and Environment. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat if you'd like to. I'm going to start with a few housekeeping items, and then I will introduce our speakers. If you'd like to download the slides for today's conversation, please visit the webinar page on our website at healthandenvironment.org. We'll put that direct link into the chat now. This webinar is being recorded and it's scheduled to last for an hour. We'll close the chat once we begin the presentation, but we invite you to type your questions in the Q&A box at any point, and we'll get to as many comments and questions as we can. If you'd like to activate closed captions, you can do that by clicking the button at the bottom of your screen. As with all of our webinars, opinions expressed are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Collaborative for Health and Environment or its partner organization. And now I am delighted to introduce our speakers. We're really looking forward to this conversation with Dr. Kevin Elliott and Dr. Laura Vandenberg. So I will now share their very interesting bios with you. Dr. Kevin C. Elliott is a philosopher who studies the roles of social and ethical values in science and technology. He is a Red Cedar Distinguished Professor at Michigan State University with joint appointments in MSU's Lyman Briggs College, the Department of Fisheries and Wildlife, and the Department of Philosophy. Much of his scholarship is related to social issues raised by environmental pollution, and he is the author of the books Is a Little Pollution Good for You? Incorporating Social Values in Environmental Research, and A Tapestry of Values, An Introduction to Values in Science. In addition to studying the roles of social and ethical values in environmental research, he studies conflicts of interest in research, ethical issues involving science communication, and other topics. Dr. Laura Vandenberg is Associate Vice Chancellor and Vice Provost for Research and Engagement and Professor of Environmental Health Sciences at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Her research explores how early life exposures to chemicals and chemical mixtures can predispose individuals to diseases that manifest later in life. Her NIH-funded work addresses how low doses of chemicals during critical windows of development can alter gene expression, cell differentiation, and tissue organization in subtle ways that can lead to diseases in adulthood. Her work also focuses on how traditional toxicology assays have failed to identify a number of ubiquitous endocrine disruptors and how current risk assessment practices can be improved in the study and regulation of this class of chemicals. So we are really honored to have Dr. Elliott and Dr. Vandenberg with us today. The study they'll be discussing is one that we found to be very helpful and timely in thinking about how to communicate about complex environmental health topics. So with that, I will hand it over to our speakers.
Thank you, Rachel, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I really want to extend my gratitude to CHE for asking us to be here. And of course, we also want to really extend our gratitude to our co-authors and collaborators on this project, Rob Sargis, who's at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and Heather Pattisall, who, when she was participating in the project, was a faculty member at North Carolina State University. Heather's now working at NIH. And due to their travel schedules, they weren't able to join us today. But really, what we're going to share with you today is the story of a journey of the four of us coming together and working on a project. And so we want to acknowledge them and thank them for their partnership on this project. So we're going to start by first telling you how a philosopher of science partners up with lab scientists and a clinician, and how that came to be and why it became such a valuable opportunity. And I speak for myself. You're going to hear from Kevin, but I can say that this collaboration really was life-changing and to me led to the publication of one of the most important papers I think I will probably ever write. So setting the stage, we met at a Gordon Research Conference that was held in Maine. And here in the US, there's a Gordon Research Conference on environmental endocrine disruptors that's held every other year. And every other meeting is in the US versus in the European Union. So this meeting was in the US. It was in 2022. It actually was a program that was intended to be given in 2020. And of course, if you remember what happened in 2020, we also did not have a Gordon Research Conference. If you're not familiar with Gordon Research Conferences, what's really special about them is that they're small and intimate conferences, and they're intended to bring people together with a lot of discussion. Um, Folks are expected to present work that is not yet published, and then the whole point is to share what is the cutting edge work that's being done by your group, and the potential to identify new collaborators and have in-depth discussions. And so I was the discussion leader for a section that was on social, cultural, and political determinants of evaluating the risks of endocrine disruptors. And Kevin was one of the speakers who was within that session. And I can tell you from the basic scientists in the room, there was a lot of nervousness about this talk. And when I have said that multiple times, Kevin always sort of laughs about that. But really, the nervousness was this title, clarifying value judgments in research. And a lot of the researchers leading up to this were really thinking, oh, this philosopher of science is going to come in here and tell us all the things that we're doing wrong. And not only can I assure you that that wasn't the case, I also was encouraging them that even if it was the case, we should be open to hearing about that, because if we're doing something wrong, we want to know about it. That's obviously not what happened. Kevin's going to tell you a little bit about what he presented at the Gordon Research Conference. But what was kind of magical is that Gordon Research Conferences, in addition to being planned as a place for discussion and the development of new collaborations, they're also a place where you spend a lot of more social and less formal interactive time together. And what happened is that after Kevin's talk, many of us wanted to talk to him. Many, sort of bench scientists, epidemiologists really wanted to talk to him. And where we did that was over breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And it led to a whole new collaboration and a paper. So I'm going to turn it over to Kevin to tell you that story. Allow me to just give one little plug, which is that I am co-chairing the next Gordon Research Conference on environmental endocrine disruptors in 2026. It's again going to be held in the same place, Sunday Jordan River Hotel in Maine. And everyone who's on this call would be invited to apply to attend. So we would encourage you to think about the Gordon Conference as a place that you would also come to share your ideas or to meet collaborators and to expand your knowledge about endocrine disruptors. So Kevin, I'm going to turn it over to you to tell us about your talk.
Great. And that picture there of that dining room actually does bring back very fond memories of our discussions. And, despite the scientists, as Laura said, maybe being a little bit nervous about having me there, they really were very gracious and it was a wonderful opportunity. So I really appreciate it. So on to the next slide, I'll talk about what I talked about there. So I built on this book that I had written that Rachel mentioned, A Tapestry of Values. And the key point that I was hoping to make to the scientists there is that as they do their research, their work is kind of interwoven like a tapestry with all sorts of what we as philosophers might call contingent choices that aren't totally settled by the evidence. So the researchers have to decide exactly what questions to ask or to focus on, and how to categorize the phenomena that they're studying. What concepts to use, and of course, the available evidence may give them lots of guidance into how to design their studies, but they still have to make choices about exactly what kinds of data to collect, and what their goal should be, whether they want to sort of really zero in narrowly on a phenomenon and try to get very precise results, or perhaps to get somewhat more generalizable results that may cover a broader array of phenomena, but that might not be quite so precise. They're making modeling decisions. They're deciding how to interpret sometimes ambiguous data. They're deciding how much evidence they need before they make claims in papers or to the public. And they're making decisions about how they frame results. And so for me as a philosopher, I think it's really important to recognize these choices because depending on how researchers make them, they can, affect society in various ways. They affect what the scientists say, what kinds of studies they do, and what their conclusions are. And so I was very kind of, at the conference thinking about, watching for these sorts of choices. And so on the next slide, um, we discuss a little bit sort of an example of these kinds of decisions that just to give you sort of a feel for this. So this didn't actually come up at the conference, but I think this can just give you a taste of these kinds of contingent choices. So I love to give this example where you are probably familiar with James Hansen. He's a famous climate scientist. And back in 1988, he was invited to give testimony before the US Congress about global warming, as they were calling it, or climate change. And he had to decide, it was well accepted by the climate scientists that their models indicated that, human released greenhouse gases were going to contribute to warming temperatures. But it wasn't so clear whether they could already see at that point already a signal of warming temperatures. And he thought, based on the work that he and his team had been doing, that we could. And so he went ahead and made that claim to Congress that global warming is already happening now. And some other climate scientists weren't so sure the evidence was compelling enough to actually make a powerful claim like that in front of Congress. You see this quotation from Alan Robach saying, no, we're not sure about this. And here he's telling Congress this. But Hansen really recognized this as a choice he had to make, where he had to decide how clear of a statement to make based on the evidence he had. And he felt like, considering the costs of, saying something and maybe being wrong, versus the costs associated with not making the claim when he did have some evidence for it. And he felt like he should go ahead and make that claim. So that's just one example of the decisions that researchers face as they're communicating information. So turning to the conference itself, one of the things that I noticed associated with the communication that the scientists were doing at the conference itself is that they were talking about various effects that these endocrine disrupting chemicals that they were studying could have. And so they were mentioning things like worries about the obesity epidemic that we're facing and the ways in which endocrine disrupting chemicals could possibly contribute to that, or ways in which endocrine disrupting chemicals could contribute to autism or ADHD. And what I was recognizing is that these involved tricky choices trying to decide how sort of strongly to emphasize these sorts of effects. And I was realizing that there could be some tensions between different ethical values, where on the one hand, researchers want to protect people from exposure to chemicals that could have significant biological effects. But they also have to consider how their claims are going to be taken up in society, the ways in which the claims they make could, promote stigmatization. Say, if one's emphasizing, we have a huge social problem here with an obesity epidemic, the impacts of making those kinds of claims. And, there can be other tensions as well. Not just stigmatizing people, but, some claims one might make might sort of play into the hands of people who might want to promote certain kinds of misinformation or disinformation or radical political claims or things like that. And so I was intrigued by this. And so in that dining room, Laura showed you the picture, I sort of raised this with Laura and some of the other scientists. And then that led to the idea that, well, we should write a paper about this. And so, as you can see on the next slide, our goals in the paper were to highlight for others to think about these communication trade-offs that people face when talking about environmental health research. And we decided to use choices about framing EDCs as our example, sort of, but we think that this could be applicable in other cases as well. And then we didn't just want to highlight the fact that there were challenging trade-offs, but also suggest some strategies to help people address these trade-offs in a responsible way. And so that's how the paper developed. And that's what then we want to talk about a little bit more here. And so, like I just said, our focus as sort of an example of these tensions was researchers making decisions about framing their work on endocrine disrupting chemicals. And I'm guessing that this audience probably knows a lot about endocrine disrupting chemicals. You may not know quite as much about the literature on framing and science. So I just wanted to take this slide to provide a quick introduction. So, frames can be thought of as ways of presenting a message so that some features are made particularly salient. So there might be particular connections or ideas that are really brought out to the hearers. So if we continue thinking about climate change, say as an example, some communication scholars have pointed out that one can frame it to kind of highlight the uncertainty. Some folks will do that. Others will point out another frame might be, sort of unfair economic burdens, how climate change might create economic burdens on some groups as opposed to others, and those groups that are burdened may not have been the ones that contributed so much to it. Others might treat it as a kind of Pandora's box, bringing out an array of, sort of unknown effects that we need to be concerned about. Others have tried to highlight religious morality as a way to think about responsibilities to address climate change. So all these kind of feature particular aspects of it or particular implications of it. And even just say somebody's talking about climate change and they're just emphasizing, warming or precipitation or storms. Some folks have pointed out that's a kind of framing based on sort of themes, whereas one could focus more on particular cases of climate change impacts, and they would say that's more of an episodic framing. So one might not be deliberately trying to frame information in particular ways, but it actually does kind of fit into these particular ideas like a more thematic or an episodic framing. So with that background, we can turn to the next slide. And I think I'm actually going to turn this back over to Laura to then sort of talk a little bit more about how you can see some of these frames and the tensions that arise with endocrine disrupting chemical research in particular.
Thanks, Kevin. So before we dig into some of the specific examples, which we talked about in the paper, we wanted to also acknowledge that there's this challenge that's the case for endocrine disrupting chemicals, and it's not so different from the challenge that's affected people working in climate sciences, which is that there's areas of clear and honest debate where scientists, experts in the field disagree on how to interpret data or even which are the next important studies or are additional studies needed. And that is different from the cases where the data are misused or misapplied in the creation of disinformation or misinformation campaigns. Both are actually parts of framing. And both involve framing because essentially the different parties who are involved highlight different salient aspects of what evidence is available or not available. But that's not really what we're going to talk about today. So we wanted to acknowledge this before digging into some of the examples. So I'm going to give you 3 examples that we discussed in our paper. And I just want to reiterate the point that none of these examples are intended to call out people in our field, our colleagues who have chosen to use these frames, because again, there's rational reasons for using different frames. And in some cases, a frame that worked in a social context 20 or 30 years ago, you can't really hold it to the standards of today when looking back on a decision that was made during a different time. So we want to say that we pick these examples very carefully when writing our paper to highlight certain points, but not to say this person's doing it right and this person's doing it wrong. So the first example that I wanted to highlight is the effect that endocrine disrupting chemicals have on male reproduction, on hormones in males or in men, and how that has been interpreted as a challenge to masculinity. And so the framing of this, the same way we think about Hansen and his testimony to Congress as being really a change in how the discussion about climate change was had. My colleague, the late Lou Gillette, gave testimony to Congress in the 1990s about endocrine disrupting chemicals and their effects on wildlife populations. And he was speaking very broadly about the effects of endocrine disrupting chemicals on aspects of male reproduction. And the quote that he said to Congress was, "Gentlemen, you are half the men that your grandfathers are. And the question is, will your grandchildren be half the men that you are?" And that's a very particular frame. It's a very powerful statement that was really focused on strong evidence that sperm counts had declined over just a couple generations, and trends were suggesting they were continuing to decline. It's a frame, though, and it's a frame that really intends to capture attention, that centers the discussion really on male decision makers. And it did get the attention of Congress, and was effective in leading to the development of some screening programs for endocrine disrupting chemicals. The issue is that framing something as being a challenge to masculinity does have trade-offs. And we've seen this more recently with some of the right-wing media that has made discussions about work that's largely been done in animals, the effects of EDCs on male reproductive outcomes in animals, trying to apply that and question masculinity in the context of LGBTQ rights, or in the context of whether women should continue to have access to birth control because the chemicals in birth control pollute the environment and disrupt male reproduction. So there's trade-offs in the decision to focus on a decline in masculinity could also lead to some adverse social consequences like restriction of access to birth control. A second example, the developmental origins of health and disease. So a 30-second background on that concept. It really is the origin story for diethylstilbestrol, and it's also the origin story for the Dutch winter famine during World War II. The idea is that if you are in the womb and your mother is healthy and there's a healthy environment, you are likely to become an adult who is healthy. But if you're in the womb and you experience something that disrupts your health, whether that's serious malnutrition or exposures to drugs like thalidomide or diethylstilbestrol, you're going to be set up for an adulthood that you'll be at an increased risk for disease. And the disease doesn't necessarily manifest right away. The disease manifests in adulthood. So this is part of the concept. This is an important concept in the study of environmental hazards, and in particular, endocrine disrupting chemicals, where exposures in the womb have been shown to be incredibly critical in affecting lifelong disease risk. But the framing of what happens in the womb as the most important period has ended up putting a lot of pressure on pregnant people and putting responsibility for preventing disease in offspring, whether that's obesity or other conditions that are associated with early life exposures. It puts a lot of pressure on the pregnant mother to avoid exposures. And so it's a framing that's a very individualized framing, as opposed to talking instead about society's generation of these pollutants and a societal responsibility for the effects that are happening. Because of course, as we all know, during pregnancy, it's not like it's easy to avoid these chemicals. We're being exposed to them throughout the life course, and they're in places where we can't really avoid them. The third example is the example of talking about conditions, and even the term condition itself could be a loaded term in some circumstances, which we struggled with a lot. How do we talk about ADHD and autism without framing them as diseases? And it's really hard because this is how we talk about them in society. People who have autism don't want to be considered to have a disease in some circumstances. They don't consider it a disease state. Being able to frame a condition as a disease can be a very powerful tool if you're trying to get support services for your kid in school, as an example, or being able to have insurance cover a condition. It has to be something that's considered to be a health condition in some way. But the trade-off is that for people who do not wish to see their state of being as a disease state, they feel stigmatized by that. And so we have to think about even the language that we use to describe a something that would be a neuroatypia. Even atypia is it suggests that there's typical if you have atypical. And so there's real challenges here. Other language challenges that we uncovered as we were writing this paper are words like risk, which is a very common word for epidemiologists to think about risk, which is a mathematical property that is calculable. But for people who have conditions like autism or ADHD, they don't like the word risk because it suggests there's something risky about who they are or how their body works. And so that is, of course, not the intention of an epidemiologist, is to shame people, but the language itself can sometimes lead to that stigma. So these are the trade-offs. And exactly as I started by saying, we're not trying to say there's a right and a wrong way to talk about these things. We're not saying that discussing sperm count decline and the seriousness at which environmental health scientists have been treating that now for decades. I mean, Lou Gillette testified to Congress in the 1990s, and sperm count decline has continued since the 1990s. These are very serious issues, but the way that we choose to frame them has consequences. And so we want to start thinking about that. So I'm going to pass it to Kevin, who's going to talk about some of our proposed solutions, some recommendations to think about as we're communicating about science. How do we consider those trade-offs? You're always going to have to make a decision, but being aware of them is really what we're pointing towards.
Yeah, and like Laura said, we didn't just want to leave people with the awareness that these are tricky issues. We wanted to try to offer some productive ideas for moving forward. And so first, we wanted to point out that just kind of becoming aware of the social context in which scientists are operating can be helpful to make them a little bit more sensitive to think about how they might be framing their research in ways that, might interact with that social context in ways they might not want or they might want. So they might just think, are there groups that could be stigmatized or harmed depending on how this research is communicated or done? Is there a kind of historical context that may be important to be aware of that could affect how this research is received? Are there important political debates going on that could affect how this research ends up getting taken up and interpreted, or recognizing the potential for misinformation or disinformation campaigns? Are there ways in which this research could be misinterpreted? Maybe there are ways in presenting it to help sort of prevent some of those misunderstandings. We recognize that scientists don't have complete power over what their, how their research is taken up, but there may be some steps that they can take and that other science communicators can take. And then, just getting some sense for how major frames, could contribute to these harms or receptions or political debates, how it could play into this context. So part of what we're trying to encourage in the paper is for researchers to just think a little bit about these ways in which their research could be taken up, depending on how it is framed. And then another suggestion is that once researchers have this sensitivity, they might be able to deliberately choose some frames, or others communicating this science could choose frames that alleviate some of the ethical tensions that we mentioned earlier. So, Laura was mentioning when she was talking about, the Doehead case and obesity, the ways in which, individuals, say, pregnant people could, end up feeling this incredible pressure, and society could put the pressure on them, the responsibility of, not exposing, the fetus to particular chemical exposures. But, that is a very individual way of framing the situation. And so there might be ways that researchers could shift to more of a communal framing, as Laura was already suggesting, and sort of pointing out the way in which it's our societal responsibility to recognize the ways we're imposing particular exposures or environments on people that could affect them. And then in addition to this kind of shift from an individual to a communal frame, Laura mentioned the worry about say whether autism or ADHD are framed as diseases or obesity being framed as a disease. So sometimes researchers might consider, could they avoid some of these tensions or alleviate some of these tensions by focusing more on autonomy? The thought that rather than saying these chemicals are causing diseases, one could focus on the ways in which people are being exposed to chemicals without their consent that have significant biological effects. And maybe people should have more of a say over that. And again, we're not saying that it's always obvious which way to go. And we actually acknowledge in the paper that even these suggestions we're making could be in some tension with each other. That if we really push people's autonomy to choose what chemicals they're exposed to, that may kind of shift into an individual way of thinking, whereas we recognize there are some benefits to the communal way of thinking. So these are not simple issues, but we're trying to help scientists and science communicators be a little bit more sensitive and thoughtful about some of the pros and cons of these different frames. So then another suggestion is that it may seem like, wow, we are putting a lot of pressure on the people communicating this information. And we want to highlight that it doesn't all have to rest on some scientists trying to do research and then trying to figure out how to talk about it. We can create creative collaborations where researchers work with people thinking about biomedical ethics or other philosophy of science like the work that I do, or social scientists or historians who can help them to pick up on some of the ways in which their frames could be taken up in society. And so our own paper, of course, is an example of trying to work together to highlight these issues. And researchers are increasingly recognizing the benefits of community collaborations. And so, as Laura was saying, autistic people, and even there are crucial questions about framing autistic people versus people with autism. And it can be valuable to actually talk to that community and say, how do you prefer communication in this area? And not everyone may agree. It's not like you have one single community that's going to agree on everything, but starting to talk with people can be helpful for both becoming more sensitive to issues and potentially more ethically and socially aware about how one communicates about these really tricky topics. And then, sort of furthermore, again, sort of going beyond just pressure on individuals, we can think about how different kinds of institutions can support researchers and science communicators in being more thoughtful. So funding agencies can actually help make these kinds of interdisciplinary and community-based collaborations more possible by providing funding for them. Universities, depending on how they're incentivizing their researchers, what is respected in annual reviews and tenure and promotion criteria, they can either encourage or discourage these kinds of collaborations that can help researchers be more thoughtful with their communication. And organizations, we can put in a plug for Che here that by providing these kinds of workshops, that can help people to become more aware of these issues and provide opportunities for reflecting on these issues. And we even found with our own paper that the journal editors and the reviewers were very helpful for, we were already trying to be sensitive to how we were talking about these issues, but they still helped us pointing out, do you actually want to use particular terms or particular ways of framing the discussion that we were talking about? So again, a whole community can work together to help to address these really tricky issues. And then I'll turn it back to Laura to finish up our
To take us home.
Yeah.
So one thing that we want the community to consider is whether there's some frames that really should be avoided because of changing in times. And chemical castration, this is a term that sometimes has been used to describe endocrine disrupting chemicals that lead to an inability to produce sperm at all. This is a term that really makes me uncomfortable because it evokes some of the treatment of folks during the Holocaust. It's often evokes treatments that have been used in interventions for people who are pedophiles. And so the framing itself may be one that just should be avoided when thinking about endocrine disruptors, because it it leads people to think things that are not actually consistent with the science of endocrine disruption. And similarly, the obesity epidemic, there's been some really interesting public press articles about whether obesity has been presented as a sort of moral panic, which is a phrase that's used to suggest sort of like a moral hysteria around an issue that is being overblown in its impact. And certainly, obesity is a condition that can be very serious. It often comes with it other health complications. But the way that we have often framed the obesity epidemic is, again, one of a moral issue as opposed to one of a health issue. And so, what we really want to offer as a take home is that there is no perfect frame. We're always making judgments about how we communicate our work. And those of us who are trained as basic scientists, as an example, often don't get a lot of training in science communication. We get better with it with time. We're constantly trying to develop our skills. And those of us who really work at it, usually because we teach undergraduates, so we have to become good storytellers in order to share information with people who are really learning the basics in the field. We're constantly making choices about how do we frame the stories that we tell? How do we even choose which are the right examples to share? And we just need to remember those are value. Those are value judgments. Those are value-based decisions, and that there are trade-offs to them. And I am constantly learning when I talk to my students about really biology information, but that has social impact. And this is certainly true for some of the neurological conditions that we talked about today. It's true for issues related to gender identity and the influence of environmental chemicals on gender identity, as well as sexual differentiation. And we wrote this paper before we sort of entered the current political climate. That's not what our intention was, is to sort of dabble in the current political climate. This is really a conversation around how to think about communication in a way so that you're really thinking through the ways in which a message is received and best conveyed, as well as how it might be misused or misinterpreted. So with that, Rachel, we're going to stop sharing our slides, and hopefully you can help us manage any Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks for that really excellent presentation. And I see we've got some questions. So I'll start with this one. One question is, can you comment more on what point in the research process it's most useful to consider framing? So is it primarily when you're releasing results, or is it when you're designing your study, or both? So just comments on timing.
Do you want to jump in, Laura, or should
You
I?
start, Kevin, because I'm so interested in what you think about that.
Well, that's a really interesting question. And I can't resist thinking, as that question is brought up, about a handbook that I'm editing right now on values in science. And it's largely dominated by contributions from philosophers. But we have a super interesting chapter from some conservation biologists. And it's been really interesting to me how basically it's four of them who talk about how they feel like the way they frame their research project affects it from the beginning. So the kind of the framing of it actually affects the study design. What questions they end up asking, how they decide to focus in. They're often looking at complicated issues. So this is a little different from endocrine disruption, maybe. We'll see what Laura has to say. But where, say, they're dealing with human carnivore conflicts in East Africa, and that's a really complicated issue where you can look at so many different social factors and biological factors, different species, different kinds of interventions. And so, depending on how one kind of frames one's thinking about the problem, even framing it as a conflict between humans and carnivores, can affect the way the research plays out. So I think in at least some cases, I would say it's really fruitful to think way upstream early on about how one's framing one's research. But I wouldn't want people to feel like if they weren't thinking about that at the beginning, well, there's no point in starting later on. I think it can be really valuable at the end too. But I'd love to hear what Laura has to say.
Um, I love everything you just said, Kevin. Here's what the way I think it actually works in practice is that we are doing this at every step of the scientific process. From conceptualizing the idea and pursuing grants, you have to be able to tell a story in a particular way so that it will be well received by your peers. They're going to evaluate what it is that you plan to do. When you go to publish your work, and so now you've done the experiments or the work or the data collection or the analysis, and you're going to publish it, you are making choices because you're going to decide in some cases, am I sending my work on endocrine disruptors to an endocrinology journal? There's a frame for that that's different than if I send this to an environmental health or a toxicology journal. And it seems subtle, but it's not, because as a person who reads papers or reviews papers, I sometimes think, oh, you've missed the mark. Like, there's no endocrinology in this paper, and you're trying to send it to an endocrinology journal. So I actually think that framing is something that we're doing all the time without realizing it. And here, I think sort of what we're asking folks to do is, you're already doing it. What we want you to do is to think about the consequences of that framing, and the parties that are involved that could be helped in some cases or harmed in other cases by that framing. But I think Kevin's right that the earlier you are thinking about framing, and now I'm wearing my research administrative hat, the easier it is to figure out what is it you're trying to do. Like, what's the problem you're trying to solve? Am I trying to figure out what molecule is responsible for this specific outcome? Or am I trying to come up with an answer that says estrogenic chemicals are bad? They're bad for the mammary gland. And so, right, the level of evidence and the level at which that evaluation is going to happen is different because of how I framed that question.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. Um, let's see. So we've got a number of interesting questions here. Okay, so here's a question. The term vulnerable communities is one we use often. I'm just reading this question from the screen. But I think it's important to point out that those communities we are referring to are not intrinsically vulnerable, but are placed in that position by the policy decisions. Is this the type of issue you are referring to? Do you have any thoughts on how to better reflect the challenges faced by overburdened communities?
Hmm. I love that point, and it's exactly the sort of thing that we're thinking about. I think that's a great example. And I think it's nice that the questioner actually themselves pointed out right at the end, referring to overburdened communities. Again, there are pros and cons to different kinds of language, but I think the questioner was right on target to point out that, vulnerable brings out particular kinds of connotations, maybe suggests that there's something inherently sort of weak or problematic about that community, versus overburdened places more of the emphasis on the way that community is placed or contextualized in society and the way others are contributing to that. Kind of, again, thinking about the communal framing versus kind of, that community is kind of like an individual. So I would just say that that's a wonderful example. I really like the way the questioner put it.
Yeah, I'll add that there continues to be scientific debate, not about this question in particular. I agree entirely that a vulnerable community is one that has been failed by policy, by society, by human decisions. But vulnerable periods of life or sensitive windows or critical windows, those terms are all used interchangeably. Oftentimes, it's sort of in the middle of a sentence. You don't want to say the thing you've already said, so you say the next thing. but they do evoke different imagery. And so it can be important to make sure that as you're using these kinds of terms that you are really thinking about, are you vulnerable because you're more highly exposed? That's different than a vulnerability that comes from a physiological difference of, a fetus's brain is at a different stage than an adult's brain. And so I love this question, because it really sort of hints at uh, the language that we use, that we hear repeated, that then leads us to think a particular thing. Vulnerable stages of life is a thing. Vulnerable communities isn't really a thing, other than the fact that we have burdened them, as the questioner mentions.
And maybe I'll also just add, I should admit, I'm a philosopher of science. Different scholars have different kinds of strengths. If we had like an expert communication scholar, here, they might, draw a distinction between, say, frames in general and like maybe metaphors and terminology. And so they might say in this particular case, yeah, actually, these are slightly different terms being used. I don't know if they would exactly call them frames, but this is exactly what I would still say is a super important ethical choice that illustrates these trade-offs, these tensions. And I love Laura's example that, a part of what we're hoping scientists could think about is, well, is vulnerable the best term here? Is critical a better term? Is sensitive? These each have particular connotations, and we would love for researchers to be thinking about those kinds of questions.
Great. Thank you so much. So another question, there are a couple of questions on this theme. So there's a question about the evidence on endocrine disrupting chemicals and gender identity and other related trends. So yeah, would you like to comment on that?
For questions about evidence, I'm going to turn that over to Laura.
So when it comes to the scientific evidence, first of all, I think that the frame of this question is really asking us to think about whether there are some questions that aren't allowed to be asked because they're sort of politicized questions, or do they bump up against social issues that are hot button topics. And I think that absolutely, and in fact, I've recently spoken to a reporter who's writing a story about this, and I'm happy to, when it gets published, I'm happy to share that. And that reporter is having a hard time to finding scientists who are willing to talk openly about whether environmental chemicals might be affecting gender identity and aspects of gender identity. So the evidence is actually, it's challenging to draw a line between endocrine disrupting chemicals and gender, and I don't want to say disruptions too, because that suggests that there's some normal state, but changes in prevalence of people who identify as LGBTQ. Um, some of the evidence it is super interesting work that has looked at things like socialized play behaviors in boys versus girls. And there's some really interesting studies that have come from colleagues in Sweden that have looked at socialized play behaviors where sort of, if you look at a large population of boys versus a large population of girls, boys are more likely to play with the hammer and the blocks, and the little girls are more likely to play with the tea set and the doll. And of course, these are overlapping. So there are always some boys who play with the tea set, and there's always some girls who play with the hammer. I was one of them. And so the issue with those studies, and I find these studies really fascinating for two reasons. One, my colleagues who are participating in some of that work as epidemiologists are working with social scientists as a way to make sure that they're being responsible in how they design the studies and discuss the studies. And the funders who have funded that work in the European Union are requiring that, which I think is really important. It's getting at the heart of what Kevin and I have talked about today. The other thing that's really interesting about it is that those social play behaviors, which are gendered, which they did show were disrupted by exposure to some phthalates and other environmental chemicals, skills, those socialized play behaviors are different in Swedish children than they are in children in the US. So the same metric that they use to evaluate gendered behaviors in small children wouldn't work here in the US. You'd have to design an entirely different study because gender is a socialized construct, and how children are taught to play and what's an appropriate way of playing is different depending on where you grow up. And I find that fascinating as a biologist who studies rodents, and I don't have any context for doing the research myself. I think it's really interesting. I do think that so there's also a few studies. They're small, old, and I think very limited in how they can be interpreted. That suggest that, as an example, individuals who were exposed to diethylstilbestrol, the synthetic estrogenic chemical, had an increased likelihood of identifying as LGBTQ as an adult. And so that starts to highlight that there's the possibility that exposures to some estrogenic chemicals might have an effect on gender identity. For the most part, this work hasn't been done. And I think that it hasn't been done in part because these are challenging social questions that have to be, the study itself has to be designed in a way that respects the humanity of the people who are participating in those studies. Because the idea that the framing would be EDCs are a pollutant, and a pollutant is what makes you LGBTQ. That's sort of gross by design and should be avoided in the design of such a study. So I really like this question. I really appreciate that someone asked this question, because I think that it's a perfect example of a tug between a social and political environment, as well as scientists trying to be cautious about how their work might be used or misinterpreted, and that it could harm people.
And one small additional point, I really appreciate your input, Laura, is, I love your point about the scientists working with social scientists or ethicists, thinking about designing those studies, because again, there are so many tricky questions when you're dealing with complex issues like that. How one designs the studies, how one asks the questions, as you pointed out. And there's some really nice philosophical work also pointing out that there are often background assumptions in the background that affect how one moves from the evidence one has to drawing particular conclusions. And so one might say, well, given the evidence we have, this is the conclusion to draw. And bringing in additional perspectives from other scientists, people from other disciplines, they may point out, there are some assumptions in the background that are affecting the conclusions you're drawing here. And maybe we need to be more careful. There could be some other ways of interpreting the data. And so I just think with these kinds of studies, it's really important to have that thoughtful, collaborative sort of work.
Thank you. These are great, great questions and great answers. Okay, I'm going to read one that's maybe more of a comment than a question, but I'm sure you'll have comments on it. So one person wrote, this is of tremendous interest to our organization, a cancer support group, who are uniquely placed to interpret this information for cancer thrivers or raising awareness of EDCs to policymakers and government. Context is so important, and we switch it up depending on audience. We collaborate with teachers and health practitioners to help us communicate. This has been very helpful. So any comments on that?
I have started a lot. Do you want to start, Laura, or I can? Okay. I'll just note, it's really great to hear that this is relevant. I love, as you kind of emphasize, Rachel, and as that questioner pointed out, even, framing it as cancer thrivers, is a really cool point that, some people might not think to use that kind of terminology. And I like that the questioner brought up the role of audience. And because I think that's something that maybe we haven't talked about a ton, but we were highlighting the importance of sensitivity to the context in which information is being provided. So I like the way the questioner pointed out that maybe a frame that might work well with one audience, that brings out things relevant to them, might not necessarily be the most fruitful frame for another audience. And And I acknowledge maybe one challenge is sometimes if you're putting out information and it's not exactly clear, who the audience are, you're going to have a lot of different audiences. That raises further challenges. So we don't claim to have all the answers, but I love that the questioner is bringing out those issues of audience that I think are important for us to think about.
And I certainly think about this when I give talks to the public, that if the talk is to a bunch of people who are planning to get pregnant, I do not want to scare people. That is not an effective tool. Like, we know there's a lot of research on how frightening people doesn't lead to better choices. It leads often to paralysis. And so providing people with actionable information is what often we're trying to do in that setting. And that kind of messaging for patients is very different from the kind of messaging you do for the clinicians who are trying to give advice to patients. And I really appreciate here the wish to communicate to policymakers and people in the government, is that sometimes what we're asking them is to please use the power that they've already been given.
Yeah, well, there's a question here that I think ties in with what you were just saying, Laura. So this person writes, when it comes to reducing exposure to endocrine disrupting chemicals in preconception, how do you think responsibility might be effectively framed at the levels of individuals, couples, households, or society? And are there alternative framings that could better support meaningful change?
I agree entirely. I mean, oftentimes the advice that we give people is so focused on how to clean your house differently, how to switch out your products. And that can be helpful because people do want to feel that they have some control over their lives. But when I talk to the public, when I talk to reporters, I try to always make sure that somewhere in there is the frame of the need for societal level change. That people who are trying to avoid these chemicals often cannot. You can't shop your way around this problem. We, in some cases, see that wealthy people have higher levels of these chemicals than people at a lower socioeconomic status. So you would think, oh, they're buying their way out of exposure. No, they're not. They're buying their way into exposure in those cases. And so I do think I often try to frame it as the need for regulation and the need for health protective regulation, and also the need for precautionary regulation. So not needing to know that exactly in which way every chemical is going to affect us, but rather if something is estrogenic, it shouldn't be in my soap.
I really like the way, Laura, you put that. I don't have a lot to add except just to emphasize that I think what Laura really brought out there was that shift from the individual to the communal framing. And, a point we make in the paper is the sort of danger that if we put too much focus on the idea that individuals can address these problems, we may be missing out on the most important, effective ways to address them at that more social level. And this is something that applies across lots of cases. The climate scientist Michael Mann has written about sort of the significance of framing responding to climate change in an individual way, trying to get people to say be more energy efficient at an individual level versus the social policy solutions that we could pursue. Often the social policy solutions are far more effective, and we kind of set ourselves potentially down the wrong path by focusing just on the individual. So I think these are applicable across a lot of cases.
Great, thank you so much. So we're pretty much out of time. I'm thinking of just reading you one more question. Maybe you could just see if you have a quick answer for this one, and then we'll start to wrap up. So this person writes, related to issues with social or societal and personal versus individual or personal/individual effects like disability, how can scientists continue to ethically research these topics? They are often framed as problems to be solved. How can scientists consciously research chemicals like EDCs without causing more stigma? And in particular, do you have thoughts for those who are not able-bodied or identify as disabled?
Mm. So I think that what Kevin was saying about the ability to partner with people who are affected by what it is that you're studying, whether that's the disabled community or even, a smaller group within the disabled community, because that's a very large umbrella, or families of people who are affected by a disability, or if it's your LGBTQ, or if it's that you uh, uh, have some other, autism or some other condition, partnering with actual people who are affected by those issues is really important. I also saw a comment from someone I know, hi, that said, uh, you know, if you want to do work that honors people and their lived experience, you should have those people also be researchers. And so we need to make the doors open to folks who are LGBTQ or disabled or what have you, so that the research community is not always going to the community, but is also inclusive of the community that's being studied. I actually think that's a low bar, right? Like this is totally achievable. We should not study people. We should involve people in our studies.
So beautifully put. And I would just add our point that, institutional structures can help to make that all the more possible. So, funding agencies can make a point of facilitating this, and, university policies can, reward scientists for doing this kind of work rather than, sort of making it more challenging because they just want researchers to churn out the next paper. So I think Laura put that perfectly, and we should be supporting scientists to make this as feasible as possible.
Great, thank you. Okay, well, I'll just ask Laura and Kevin, is there anything you really want to say before we wrap up?
Thank you, Rachel. This has been fantastic, and I think part of the message is we shouldn't be afraid to have these conversations, because that prevents us from doing the good work.
Great.
So much appreciate the opportunity, and I'm grateful for everybody who showed up.
Super. Okay, well, thank you both so much, and thank you so much to everyone who's participated. Thanks for the wonderful questions that you've posed and excellent comments. So I will just go to my quick wrap-up notes now. A video recording of this conversation will be available on Che's website soon, and you will all receive an email with a link to that recording. Some of you may also be interested in joining us next week on July 16th for a Che Alaska webinar on carbon capture and storage, and we'll share that link in the chat now. And at the end of the webinar, you'll be directed to a Google form if you'd like to provide any feedback, and we'll also put that link into the chat now. So thank you again to all of you for joining us, and many thanks to Alyssa Tay and Kristen Schaefer for all of their help behind the scenes.